From a children's book that featured a monkey asking his female partner to lift up her skirt so he could watch her pee, to another child's book which featured a man decapitating his wife on her deathbed. Here are some of the most traumatic things found inside children's books. In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories. Alvin Schwartz, 1984. Most people who grew up in the 80s and 90s remember Alvin Schwartz, from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which became infamous for the kind of nightmares it left behind. It was an anthology that fed a generation's nightmares, with illustrations so grotesque that parents petitioned school boards and libraries eventually pulled copies from circulation. But Schwartz had actually started doing this years earlier. In A Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories, published in 1984, and ran for early readers who were just learning to sound out words. The stories are extremely short, sometimes just a single paragraph, but the book's most well-known entry is a story called The Green Ribbon, and it does more damage in 2 pages than most horror novels manage across 300. The story is about a girl named Jenny who has been wearing a green ribbon around her neck from childhood. Soon the girl meets a guy named Alfred who begins to ask her about the ribbon around her neck and why she has always been wearing it, but Jenny never told Alfred why. They grow older, fall in love, and eventually marry, and through all of it, Jenny never removes the ribbon. As the years pass, Jenny falls sick and she lies in her deathbed. She finally gives Alfred permission to untie the ribbon, and what happens next is why the story stuck with people for decades. That one sentence is why the book was challenged and banned in schools across the country, with formal complaints describing it as too morbid for its intended age group. And what makes it even more unsettling is that this story didn't start with Schwartz. Various versions of the tale, featuring a woman who conceals her missing head with a ribbon, necklace, or elaborate neckwear, appear across European and American literature. One of the earliest known examples dates back to 1823, when English writer Horace Smith published Sir Guy Eveling's Dream, a story in which a man falls for a beautiful woman whose ornate neckwear hides the marks of a hanging. The following year, Washington Irving published The Adventure of the German Student, set during the French Revolution, in which a scholar meets a woman below the guillotine who wears a broad black band round her neck, clasped by diamonds, and who, after a night spent together, is revealed the next morning to have been guillotined the previous day. When a police officer removes the collar, her head rolls to the floor. Irving later noted, the story came to him secondhand through Irish writer Thomas Moore, who had heard it from Smith, suggesting the core image had already been circulating orally before either man committed it to paper. The controversy around this book was obvious. The title alone already told you what you were getting into. However, the controversy around her next story, which is The Lawn Boy, was different, because it arrived years after publication, buried inside a book that had already been reviewed, reissued, and placed on school reading lists without incident. Lawn Boy, Jonathan Evison, 2018. In September 2021, after a growing group of parents began protesting a book they had found in their children's school library, the school district called a board meeting to address the backlash. During that meeting, for the Leander Independent School District in Texas, one parent stood up and described a novel called Lawn Boy as full of obscenity and sexual content.
I'll share with you the exceptional quality of vocabulary. I stopped counting on page 66 after 44 and 41.
The backlash didn't stop when the meeting ended, because afterward, 3 people went to the local police station to file a report. Lawn Boy is a coming-of-age novel by Jonathan Evison, follows Mike Munoz, a 22-year-old man of Mexican descent trying to navigate economic hardship in Washington State's Olympic Peninsula. However, the problem with the book is that it contained an unusually high amount of sexual content for its intended audience. One of those pages read, "But there's one thing I'd never tell Nick in a million years. Not that it really matters. In 4th grade at a church youth group meeting, out in the bushes behind the parsonage, I touched Doug Gubble's dick, and he touched mine. In fact, there were even some mouths involved." Then the story gets even more graphic when he tries to convince his homophobic friend that he had a homosexual encounter with another 10-year-old when he himself was 10. "What if I told you I touched another guy's dick?" I said. "What if I told you I sucked it? I was 10 years old, but it's true. I put Doug Gubble's dick in my mouth." And that wasn't the only instance, because later in the novel, Mike is now in his 20s and runs into Doug Gobble again, who has become a successful real estate developer. And standing there in front of this grown man in a suit, Mike's mind goes straight back to when he was 10 and doing stuff with him. All I could think about while he was chatting me up over the rim of his cappuccino was his little salamander between my 4th grade fingers, rapidly engorging with blood. He goes further. Why would Doug Gobble buy me coffee after all these years if it didn't have something to do with touching penises? And that's where the tone of the book starts to feel very different, like something else entirely. A thread that runs through the novel and doesn't resolve itself into regret or trauma or any of the emotional destinations that might make it easier to categorize. It just sits there, part of Mike's history, treated by the narrative as neither remarkable nor shameful. A lot of parents could not help but imagine their teenagers finding that book in a school library. They didn't have to imagine for long, because their teenagers already had. After the initial complaints and a decent number of death threats by the parents, officials of the school district said the books would be removed from libraries, and 2 committees would be created to assess if the books are appropriate for high school students. A few months later, in November 2021, a committee review had concluded that the book be returned to Fairfax County's high school libraries, and even that didn't settle the issue. The American Library Association's 2022 report listed Lawn Boy as the 7th most banned and challenged book in the country that year. In Utah, it was among 52 books removed by the Alpine School District following the passage of state law HB 374, which directed schools to remove materials deemed sensitive. The law defined pornographic material using 3 criteria: that the average person would find the material, on the whole, appeals to prurient interest in sex, that it is patently offensive in the description or depiction of nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, masochist abuse or excretion, and that it does not have serious literacy, artistic, political, or scientific value. 42% of the books removed under that law featured LGBTQ characters or themes. Devison, for his part, said that after news of the Texas challenge began to spread, he also started receiving death threats. The book, however, continued to remain in print. However, whether it belongs in a school library is entirely up for debate. What's notable about Lawn Boy is that its controversy emerged years after publication, and you probably had to look twice to catch it. Our next book, which is Don't Make Me Go Back Mommy, put everything on the surface. What immediately set this book apart was the description printed on its back cover. The words of the text and the objects and situations illustrated are based on months of intrusive research into the nature and practice of satanic ritual abuse. Any child who has been ritually abused will recognize the validity of the story, and that text appears in the back cover of a book meant for children. Don't Make Me Go Back Mommy, Doris Sanford, 1990. The story centers on a 5-year-old girl named Allison, whose parents start noticing something is very wrong and seek professional help, eventually discovering she and other children were ritually abused at a daycare center. The book then follows Allison's recovery through counseling and her parents' reassurances that what happened was not her fault. The illustrations move through a series of disturbing scenes, including one where a teacher offers the children a magic juice while caged white rabbits sit nearby, implied to represent the children themselves, in which the teacher likely harmed in front of the children to demonstrate consequences for speaking out. In another scene, the book depicts children standing in a circle while being told there's no way out, and all of this takes place inside a locked room. Then a girl mentions how she got married today, while a child-sized wedding veil hangs in the background and sad children carry dead white rabbits, likely a metaphor for the children themselves. What she means by saying she got married is never made clear, but given the disturbing tone of the story and a wider era of satanic ritual abuse allegations, where claims of mock weddings and ritual marriages sometimes appeared, it does not come across as something innocent. The book also featured a room called a movie store room, which is implied to be a place where abuse was recorded. While the book's final images follow Allison into recovery, the sequence that precedes them is dense with the specific imagery that characterized satanic ritual abuse accounts during this period. For some context about why someone thought this book would be necessary, the book arrived near the tail end of what historians now call the satanic ritual abuse panic, a period stretching from the early 1980s into the mid-1990s, during which hundreds of people across the United States were accused, and dozens convicted, of organizing ritualistic abuse of children in daycare settings.
In what may become one of the biggest child molesting cases ever on record, 7 nursery school teachers were arraigned today on more than 100 counts of child molestation.
The accused include the preschool owner, 76-year-old Virginia McMartin, her daughter, and 2 grandchildren.
The most prominent case involved the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, where charges were filed against 7 people in 1984 after a parent reported that her son had been abused. The allegations that followed were sweeping. Children described tunnels beneath the school, animal sacrifices, and abuse by figures in costumes. The trial ran until 1990 and ended with no convictions, having become the longest and most expensive criminal proceeding in American history to that point. During the investigation, the tunnels the children described were not found. However, a subsequent private excavation after the property was sold did uncover what some described as unusual underground spaces, though the findings were disputed and no official investigation was reopened. By the mid-1990s, the FBI had released a report concluding there was no credible evidence that organized satanic cults had engaged in ritualistic child abuse on any meaningful scale. Most of the convictions secured during the panic were eventually overturned on appeal. Investigators later found that the way children were interviewed played a major role, because leading questions often shaped the stories they told. The book soon went out of print, but by that point, it had already left a lasting impact. However, our next story, which is the Animorph series, was on a completely different level, embedding its most disturbing content so deep inside the logic of a children's adventure story, most of its readers didn't fully process what they had encountered until they were old enough to think about it differently. The Animorph series, K.A. Applegate, 1996 to 2001, the David Trilogy. Animorphs was a sci-fi series aimed at kids by K.A. Applegate. It ran for 54 books between 1996 and 2001. The story follows 5 teenagers who are given the ability to transform into any animal they touch by a dying alien alien named Elfangor. They use that power to fight a secret invasion of parasitic aliens called Yeerks. These are slug-like creatures that enter the ear canal, wrap themselves around a host's brain, and take complete control of the body while the host remains fully conscious and aware inside, unable to resist. The books were shelved in the children's section of every major bookstore chain and library in the country, and the covers featured holographic foil that showed a human figure morphing into an animal. But things take a darker turn later in the series, specifically in books 22 through 24 in a sequence that fans later labeled the David Trilogy, where Applegate introduced a character named David. David is introduced as a kid their age who stumbles onto the Escafil device, the blue cube that Elfangor used to give the original 5 their morphing ability when he finds it buried inside a construction site wall near the mall. The Animorphs recognize immediately what he has and what it means. If the Yeerks get it, they can give the morphing power to anyone they want, and the balance of the war tilts catastrophically. But before the group can retrieve it quietly, the situation spirals when Visser 3 shows up at David's house. His parents are taken and infested. David is suddenly a hunted kid with nowhere to go and no one to protect him. So when the group meets him, they vote on whether to bring him in. Although he was eventually let in, the vote was very close. This makes it clear that David is in an uphill battle to convince everyone that he deserves a spot in the group. However, they go ahead with it, touch the cube to David's hand, and welcome him as a 6th Animorph, fully aware that he's the outsider. In a group with everyone already establishing where their loyalties lie in the shared history, David resents the group. He openly resents Jake's leadership and begins challenging him, constantly questioning why Jake gets to make the decisions and order everyone around. He also hates the group's overall dynamic, sensing they only brought him in because they needed what he offered, not because they genuinely wanted him there. Some of that reading isn't even wrong, but instead of working through it, he uses it as a permission to stop caring about the group's rules, their mission, or what happens to the people around him. Over time, his behavior escalates in ways that make the early warning signs look minor. He begins acting unilaterally and prioritizes his own survival and comfort over the mission and over his teammates. And during the David Trilogy, from books 20, 21, and 22, he moves from difficult to actively dangerous and attempts to kill several members of the group. He even comes close to succeeding more than once. In one of those attempts, he had morphed into a tiger attempting to maul Jake, the leader. By the time the others fully understand what they're dealing with, the situation has reached a point where there are only 2 real options, which was stop him permanently or let him burn everything down. Eventually, the group is forced into a decision that feels worse than killing him. They trick David into morphing into a rat, hold him in that form past the 2-hour limit that allows a morph to be reversed, and strand him on a small, isolated rock in the ocean, alive, aware, and permanently locked inside an animal body with no possibility of return. The chapter in which this happens is narrated by Rachel, who's consistently the most aggressive and least conflicted member of the group, and even she can barely hold herself together as she sits in the boat and listens to David's screaming grow quieter across the water. David appears again briefly in a later book, still a rat, on that same rock they left him. However, the Animorphs never went back for him. They made a decision, and the series treats it as a decision they will carry, without the comfort of having been wrong. While Animorphs buried its dark moments inside a fast-moving story, The Lonely Doll did the opposite and put everything right on the page in 1957 and stayed in print for nearly 5 decades, during which time, most of what made it unusual went largely unremarked upon. The Lonely Doll, Dare Wright, 1957. The Lonely Doll was written and photographed by Dare Wright, born in 1914 in Ontario and raised in Cleveland, who worked as a child actor and fashion model before becoming a photographer herself. She shot editorials for publications including Good Housekeeping, converted a closet in a West 58th Street apartment into a darkroom, and in her spare time made elaborate self-portraits and gowns and costumes she had sewn herself. The book was a bestseller when it was published, and Wright went on to produce 20 photo books for children, including 9 more in the Lonely Doll series, before her death in 2001 at the age of 86. The story is told through black and white photographs of a doll named Edith, an Italian Lenci doll made of felt, whose pliable material made her, in the words of Brooke Ashley, executor of Wright's estate, more malleable, more expressive, with kind of an eerie face. Edith lives alone, until 2 stuffed bears, a large Mr. Bear and a smaller Little Bear, arrive to become her companions. The story follows Edith and Little Bear as they sneak into a bedroom while Mr. Bear is away, where they try on clothes, smear lipstick across their faces and write in a mirror. When Mr. Bear returns and finds what they've done, he disciplines them. In the photos that follow, Edith is shown being punished by Mr. Bear in a way that many readers later found unsettling. Edith is positioned face down across Mr. Bear's lap while he spanks her skirt hiked up and his paw suspended in the air. Little Bear watches him from the side, his arms thrown up, being the only figure in the sequence whose body language registers anything. Despite this, the book stayed popular in certain circles. Musician Kim Gordon once cited the book as formative in an interview with the New York Times, saying it gave her "my first idea of New York as a glamorous place." She added that when she later tried to read it to her daughter, the reaction was immediate. "This is so dark and terrifying." In 2004, Wright's biographer, Jean Nathan, published The Secret Life of the Lonely Doll, a work that documented the circumstances of Wright's life in ways that significantly reframed the book. books. The context behind the book becomes even stranger when you look at Wright's personal life. Her mother, Edie, cut off contact with Wright's father and brother after their divorce, and until Edie's death in 1975, the two women remained each other's primary companions, sharing a bed well into Wright's adulthood, with Edie still painting her daughter as a teenager even after Wright had entered her 40s. It was Edie who indirectly set the whole series in motion in 1950 when she sent Wright a box containing childhood books and Edith the doll, who had been named after Edie herself. Wright began sewing miniature versions of her own clothing for the doll, added a blonde wig and hoop earrings, and started photographing her. Wright's biographer, Jean Nathan, described Edith as becoming an effigy of her own. The woman who created one of the most quietly unsettling picture books of the 20th century was, by most accounts, a woman who had never fully been allowed to grow up herself. Some critics later suggested that the figures of Mr. Bear and Little Bear reflected Wright's attempt to recreate what she called her own holy trinity: herself, a brother, and a father. The family structure denied to her in childhood, reconstructed in miniature throughout adult life. Then the artist Cindy Sherman, responding to the biography, wrote that although she had never read the book as a child or seen Wright's photographs before, it's as if I somehow did, describing a strong connection to the author's obsessiveness and role-playing. Not long after that biography came out, the book quietly went out of print because Wright had died 3 years earlier. Up to this point, most of these books were controversial because of how dark they were. So heavy, they seemed out of place beside picture books about ducks and trains. Where Willie Went took a completely different direction but still ended up just as controversial, by personifying a sperm, naming him Willie, and charting his journey to fertilize an egg in a picture book aimed at 4 to 8-year-olds. Where Willie Went, Nicholas Allen, 2004. Published in 2004 by Knopf, the book was written and illustrated by Nicholas Allen, whose previous work included The Queen's Knickers, a comic picture book imagining what the British monarch keeps in her underwear drawer. Where Willie Went applies the same irreverent register to the subject of conception and reproduction. It does not leave much to the imagination. Willie is introduced as one of millions of sperms living inside a man named Mr. Brown. The opening illustration renders this as a cross-section of Mr. Brown's testicle drawn as a miniature town complete with a sperm bag, a swimming pool, and a cinema, all filled with tiny cartoon figures going about their day. The story then focuses on Willie specifically, who's not particularly academic. When his teacher asks how many competitors he'll have to beat in the upcoming great swimming race, Willie can't answer because he isn't very good at math, but he is very good at swimming. He practices every day in preparation for the race, whose prize is the egg inside Mrs. Brown. Before the race, Willie's teacher hands out maps, which are actually labeled diagrams of both the male and female reproductive systems. That night, when Mr. and Mrs. Brown are shown together in bed, suggested through a simple illustration of their bedroom with lumpy bedclothes suggesting their presence underneath, the race begins. Willie outswims his main rival, reaches the egg, and burrows in. Rudimentary time-lapse illustrations then show the egg developing into a fetus, Mrs. Brown visibly pregnant, and eventually giving birth to a baby girl. The final page notes that as the girl grows older, she discovers she's not very good at math, but she is very good at swimming. Even with that lighthearted ending, the book would later become a frequent source of controversy. Over time, it started appearing on lists of commonly challenged books like the American Library Association, with many objections centering on its educational but unusually direct presentation of reproduction. Critics pointed to the anthropomorphized sperm, cartoon depictions of adult anatomy, the anatomically labeled diagrams handed out to the sperm like classroom worksheets, and the broader concern among some parents that the material was too explicit for children as young as 4. At the same time, the backlash was far from universal, and responses often depended on geography and cultural attitudes towards sex education. In Taiwan and China, the book was adopted into sex education curricula and treated as a straightforward, age-appropriate introduction to reproduction. Although the main controversy around Where Willie Went was always about what it chose to show, the weight of Island of the Blue Dolphins comes from something the writer chose not to soften. In a survival story drawn from documented historical events that Odell adapted into a children's novel, then declined to make easier than it actually was. Island of the Blue Dolphins, Scott Odell, 1960. Island of the Blue Dolphins follows a young Native American girl named Karana who, after jumping from an evacuation ship to stay with her 6-year-old brother, is left stranded alone on an island off the coast of California where she will remain, without another human being, for the next 18 years. Her brother is killed by wild dogs within days of their being stranded together. The book begins with Karana's tribe, already under pressure from Aleutian hunters, have come to the island to hunt sea otters for the Russian fur trade, and whose presence has escalated into violent conflict with the Nicoleño following a massacre that kills most of the island's men. The surviving Nicoleños are evacuated by Spanish missionaries. In the chaos of departure, Karana realizes that her 6-year-old younger brother Ramo has been left behind on the island and jumps from the departing ship to stay with him. Within days of their being alone together on the island, he wanders off and is killed by a pack of wild dogs. Piranha is then alone on the island for the remainder of the novel, which spans years. What follows is a survival narrative that Odell renders without the reassurance their rescue is imminent. Without a secondary character to provide dialogue, Piranha builds shelter, fashions weapons, which the tribal law of her people technically forbids women from making. She learns to hunt and fish, then eventually tame one of the dogs from the same pack that killed her brother. She lives through seasons and years with no company, no certainty that any ship will ever return. She even tries to escape by building a canoe, paddles out into open ocean at night, alone, navigating by stars. But soon, the canoe starts leaking, so she bails water with a basket for hours in the dark, even though she makes it far enough that when she looks back, the island has disappeared, but it soon became that the canoe won't make it, so she turns back. And then there's the dog, the leader of the pack that killed Ramo, which is a large gray dog with yellow eyes that she has been hunting for months. She finally catches it and puts an arrow in his chest. He disappears into the brush, but she tracks him for days until she finds him collapsed near a cliff, the broken arrow shaft still in him, lying in the dirt with his head down, but cannot get herself to kill him. Why I did not send that arrow, I cannot say. I stood on the rock with a bow pulled back and my hand would not let it go. So she carries him home, removes the arrow and cleans the wound. Then she makes him sleep outside on a rock for 4 nights because she's afraid of him. Then he leaves the fence open every morning so he can leave, but every day, when she comes home, he's still there. So he adopts him and names him Rontu, which means fox eyes. The novel was originally conceived for an adult audience, but when Odell submitted it, publishers made it a children's book because of the age of its protagonist, and by 1961, the book won the Newbery Medal. Some parents raised concerns over the years about the death of Ramo, and the sustained depiction of Piranha's solitude is potentially too heavy for the 9 to 12 age group it primarily targets. The book was never widely challenged or banned. The concerns raised about it never gained any significant traction, partly because the novel's critical reputation was too well established to easily dislodge, while Island of the Blue Dolphins dealt in documented historical erasure and the long silence that follows the end of a culture. Little Monkey's Big Peeing Circus was a Dutch picture book about a monkey who announces he can pee really well. It generated its own distinct controversy by moving from potty humor into territory that critics argued crossed a different line entirely. Little Monkey's Big Peeing Circus, Tjibbe Veldkamp and Kees de Boer, 2006. Published in 2006 and marketed for preschoolers, the book was written by Tjibbe Veldkamp and illustrated by Kees de Boer. It follows a boy monkey named Little Monkey who opens the book by declaring his peeing ability and deciding to turn it into a circus act. His friend Mimi, not wanting to be excluded, wants to join the performance. The premise is simply potty humor stuff, the kind of silly bodily function comedy that has fueled an entire corner of preschool books ever since Everyone Poops. Showed in the early 1990s that there was a big audience for stories that treated toilet training as something funny, instead of something stiff and clinical. Where Everyone Poops kept things simple by treating pooping as a normal fact of life shared by every creature, Little Monkey's Big Peeing Circus took a turn many readers were not expecting. The potty humor setup of the opening pages did not fully prepare them for where the story was headed. The first half plays out exactly as advertised. Little Monkey wants to pee in front of an audience, the kind of proudly inappropriate goal many preschoolers would find funny and relatable. The second half, however, is where critics began to object. In one sequence, Little Monkey pulls his pants down to show Mimi his pee. The accompanying illustration shows his pants around his ankles and Mimi's head positioned at waist height, looking directly at him. The moment the characters begin examining each other, the book crosses from toilet humor into teaching children to expose and examine private parts. All these while Little Monkey has been the only person showing his pee-pee, and Mimi, wanting to join in the fun, asks Little Monkey to look for her pee-pee. Mind you, Mimi is a girl, so she has to lift her tutu and lowers her pants while Little Monkey examines her, observing that her pee-pee appears to be missing, so she responds by inviting him to look for it. The book was never formally banned and did not appear in any major American challenged books list. Its reception, however, differed widely depending on where it was sold. In parts of Europe, it was seen as a blunt but harmless way to talk with preschoolers about the physical differences between boys and girls. In other places, especially among some American reviewers, the scenes involving mutual inspection drew criticism from parents and child development advocates who felt the humor had crossed into behavior that was not appropriate to model for children aged 2 to 5. While the debate around Little Monkey's Big Peeing Circus controversy might make a lot of sense to a lot of people, our next did not make anyone bat an eye because it was from a different time. The tomboy who changed into a real boy, Anonymous, circa 1880. The story, which circulated anonymously in 19th century collections of moral tales published for children, follows the daughter of an earl who behaves in ways the text describes as rude and noisy. She slets, plays football, and refuses to conduct herself according to the expectations placed on girls of her class and era. The story identifies this behavior as tomboyishness and presents it from the opening as a condition that will require correction. Then over the course of the story, the girl begins to physically transform into a boy. The text describes the transformation progressing until her body changing in ways the story presents as a direct consequence of her behavior. It says, "At last she grew so coarse, even her voice was rough and hoarse. On a summer night, to change her sex completely. Her parents respond to what has happened by paying a ship's captain to take her to sea where she's never seen again." In its original context, the story was doing exactly what Victorian cautionary tales were built to do. The genre used extreme physical consequences to enforce behavioral norms in children, and it never applied a light touch. A good example from the same genre is Struwwelpeter. Written by Heinrich Hoffmann and first published in Germany in 1845, the book later circulated widely in English translation during the second half of the 19th century. Its message was blunt and unforgiving. In one story, a boy keeps sucking his thumbs, so a figure called the Great Long-Legged Scissor Man appears, cuts off both thumbs at the root with enormous scissors, and then leaves. The illustration shows the scissors mid-cut and the blood in the air. In another story, a girl plays with matches and burns to death across several sequential panels, her parents weeping over what remains of her. At the time, parents had far few tools for teaching children morals or correcting behavior. There were no children's media industries, parenting guides, or modern psychology frameworks as we know them now. So many stories relied on the simple formula: show bad behavior, then show swift and frightening consequences. Victorian cautionary tales like these often threaten children with transformation, punishment, or exile from stepping outside the social order. However, our next book, which is Dustbin Baby, begins where that kind of exile would end with a child abandoned at birth who has spent her life trying to understand why. The novel follows her through a single day as she retraces every placement and institution that shaped her childhood. Dustbin Baby, Jacqueline Wilson, 2001. Published in 2001 by Jacqueline Wilson, the book follows a 14-year-old girl named April who was found as a newborn in a dustbin behind a restaurant. That's the name she eventually came to know for herself. On her 14th birthday, she decides to revisit every place that shaped her childhood. She visits the foster family who took her in as an infant, the adoptive family she was placed with as a toddler, the children's home that followed, and finally, the restaurant where she was found. As the story unfolds, each stop reveals something more painful about her past. April's first adopted mother, Janet Johnson, had longed for a child to hold on to her husband, Daniel. However, that did not help much because she became anxious and emotionally distant. Meanwhile, nothing changed for Daniel as he began to stay out and started having affairs and finally stopped coming home at all, which threw Janet in even more depression. This is the part that turned the head for most people, as it shows that Janet, falling deeper into depression, kills herself. She locked herself in the bathroom on a Sunday night and cut her wrists in the bath. At the time, April did not understand the concept of death, so she kept asking for her mother until a policewoman who came told 5-year-old April that Mummy's gone to sleep. April, steeped in fairy tales, imagined her sleeping in a castle surrounded by briars in a faraway place called heaven. The novel does not keep that pain in the background either. During her journey, April visits the woman's grave, forcing herself to confront one of the deepest wounds of her childhood. Later, when she was sent to a children's home, older children drew April into petty crime. She followed along in search for belonging. Each stop builds a picture of a childhood passed between adults and institutions that either could not hold her or did not know how. Meanwhile, her current foster father, Marion, realizes she's missing and begins searching for her, working through fear and uncertainty without knowing where she is gone, what she's doing, or when she will return. She ends the day at the same place she was found, trying to understand why she was left there in the first place. There she learns that the delivery boy who discovered her that day is now an adult who has thought about her for years. Dustbin Baby was later adapted into a BBC film and became a widely taught text in British primary schools, often used to open discussions about foster care, abandonment, and resilience with readers between 10 and 14. Some adults, however, raised concerns about the suicide storyline and the sheer accumulation of April's losses for younger readers in that age group. Most of the books in this list drew controversy because adults believed their content was inappropriate for the age group being targeted. Sold was different because it was a children's novel about child trafficking based on interviews with survivors, which some school districts condemned as child pornography in book form. Sold, Patricia McCormick, 2006. Lakshmi is a 13-year-old girl living with her family in rural Nepal. Her family is already struggling to survive. When the monsoon destroys their crops, everything collapses, and because the family can't survive otherwise, her stepfather sends her away to find work. He introduces her to a man who promises a job in the city, someone she has no reason to distrust. She crosses the border to India, believing she's going to work as a maid, and walks into a place called Happiness House full of hope. But once she arrives, it quickly becomes clear that Happiness House is not what she was promised. She understands that Happiness House is a brothel run by an old woman named Mumtaz. She tells Lakshmi she can't leave until she pays off a debt, one that Mumtaz constantly changes to make sure it is never fully paid. Once inside, Lakshmi cannot leave, cannot contact her family, and cannot refuse the clients Mumtaz sends to her room. Other girls live there too, many of whom have been trapped far longer, and some have long since stopped trying to figure out when or if they will ever get out. What follows across the pages of this book, published in 2006 by Patricia McCormick, shelved in school libraries across the United States, marketed to middle grade and young adult readers, is a 13-year-old girl being raped repeatedly. Because of these depictions, parents began filing complaints describing the book as pornographic, inappropriate for any school setting, and in the most extreme language used in those proceedings, child pornography in book form, and the pattern has repeated across districts for nearly 2 decades. A parent objects, so the book goes under review. Then some committees return it to shelves while others pull it and don't bring it back. Even years later, the controversy hasn't faded. By 2025, 19 years after publication, Sold reached the top of the LAA's most challenged books list, receiving more censorship reports than any other book in the country that year. While Sold seems to look at a real atrocity and does nothing to make it comfortable, the next story takes a different approach by constructing a fictional scenario and makes it as dark as possible. The Bunker Diary, Kevin Brooks, 2013. The novel is narrated as a diary kept by Linus Weems, a 16-year-old runaway who has been living in the streets after fleeing his wealthy family following his mother's death and subsequent arguments with his father. His decision to live through rather than return home is presented early in the book as an assertion of independence from a family structure that had become unbearable. He tries to help a man pretending to be blind. That decision is what gets him kidnapped. When Linus helps him, he's knocked out and soon wakes up in an underground bunker with no windows, no external doors, no connection to the surface, and an elevator is the only point of contact with whoever put him there. Over the next few days, more people begin appearing in the bunker. As more captives arrive, the group slowly forms uneasy relationships. Soon, a 9-year-old girl named Jenny forms a close bond with Linus, and early on, manages to negotiate food deliveries by sending polite handwritten notes up through the lift to the man Linus calls the man upstairs. By the end, there are 6 people in the bunker, which include Anja, a woman in her 20s, an older businessman, an addict, and an elderly man with a terminal brain tumor. Whenever they try to resist or escape, the captor punishes any attempt to escape with a deafening noise blasted into the bunker, gas that knocks the group unconscious, or poison supplies. At one point, when Linus tries to lure the captor into the bunker, the elevator delivers a vicious Doberman pinscher instead. When the dog attacks Bird, Fred kills it. So as punishment for the failed attempt, whoever put them down there stopped giving them food. And soon, a note arrives through the elevator claiming whoever kills another captive will be freed. And soon, Anja is strangled to death, while the killer is never definitively identified, though the novel's accumulated evidence strongly implies Bird, whose injuries from the dog attack have begun affecting his cognition and behavior. However, the captor sends a follow-up note falsely implicating Linus in the murder, designed to fracture whatever trust remains among the survivors. Fred then kills Bird accidentally while trying to protect Jenny from him, while Russell, terminally ill and unwilling to continue suffering, kills himself. The 3 survivors, who are Linus, Jenny, and Fred, remain in the bunker, weakening steadily as the food supply fails to return. The elevator descends one final time with its doors closed and does not go back up. Even the power is cut, leaving them in complete darkness with no water. This time, Fred, who is now delirious with thirst and illness, drinks bleach and Linus and Jenny are left alone, and not long after, Jenny dies in his arms. He writes that she simply falls asleep and never wakes again. In the aftermath of her death, with no other means of survival, Linus makes the shocking decision to consume her body. The diary ends mid-sentence. The Telegraph describes the novel as a uniquely sickening read, and argued it seemed to win on shock value rather than merit. So naturally, there were questions about whether the judges who made the book win had confused bleakness for literary profundity, and whether a children's prize should be awarded to a book in which a 9-year-old girl dies of starvation in a concrete bunker, and is subsequently eaten by the novel's narrator. I mean, what lesson is meant to be learned here unless it's that life is dark and you might have to eat your friend to survive? The Bunker Diary generated its controversy through psychological horror and a total absence of hope. Meanwhile, Living Dead Girl was challenged for depicting something categorically different, which was 5 years of daily rape, starvation, and psychological captivity experienced by a kidnapped child. Narrated in a flat, dissociated voice, the Publishers Weekly described as spare and damning. Living Dead Girl, Elizabeth Scott, 2008. This novel is narrated by a 15-year-old girl who calls herself Alice. She was kidnapped at the age of 10 and has been held captive ever since by her abductor, a man named Ray. Her real name is Kyla Davis, but she no longer uses that name. Ray has kept Alice small for years by strictly controlling everything she eats. He controls her food intake to keep her physically small and dependent on him. He dresses her every day in frilly, childish clothing, reinforcing her helpless, doll-like appearance. She's abused every single day. When she misbehaves, by his definition, she sits in a chair as punishment. And to intimidate her, Ray has also made it clear to Alice what happens to girls who stop being useful. He makes it clear what happens when a girl is no longer useful by telling her about another girl Ray abducted, and then killed. Soon the first Alice's body was found, but Ray was never suspected. And as the story goes, the information is not presented as a threat Ray makes explicitly. It is simply something Alice knows, with him saying stuff like, "I'd hate for your parents to die because of you." And later, when Alice explains why she doesn't run, she says, "I could run, but he would find me. He would take me back to 623 Daisy Lane and make everyone who lives there pay." When Ray tells Alice he wants her to find him a new Alice, a younger girl he can start over with, hoping it might lead her to her own death or freedom, she agrees to help him find a replacement. So she identifies Lucy, a young girl she observes at a playground, and she meets Lucy's older brother Jake, a teenager who abuses prescription drugs, and has sex with him in order to obtain information about Lucy's schedule. So she returns to the playground where Ray is waiting, but Alice uses what little strength she has left to shout at Lucy to run. Ray responds by trying to strangle her. Jake then shoots Ray, but in the chaos accidentally wounds Alice as well. As she dies, Alice tells Lucy her real name and addresses with her final thought being, "I am free." The novel was named a 2009 YALSA Best Book for Young Adults, a 2010 International Reading Association Young Adults Choices pick, and received the 2008 BCCB Blue Ribbon Award. Publishers Weekly called it disturbing but fascinating and said it exerts an inescapable grip on readers. It has been challenged and removed in multiple school districts, including recent removals in Utah for explicit depictions of child sexual abuse. Living Dead Girl depicted 5 years of daily rape in a dissociative flat prose register designed to communicate what sustained abuse does to a person's interior life. Tender Morsels takes the same subject matter, incestuous rape, sexual violence against a child, and renders it through the conventions of literary fantasy. In a novel that won major awards, collected significant critical praise, and was published with a young adult label that a substantial number of readers and critics later argued was profound miscategorization. Tender Morsels, Margot Lanigan, 2008. The book opens with a prologue character reflecting on a sexual encounter, and the first descriptive word applied to a girl in the book is slut. That is page 1 of a novel that is marketed as young adult. What follows is the story of Liga, a girl whose mother is dead and whose father begins raping her before she turns 14. And Lanigan does not soften this, as the text establishes the abuse plainly as Liga lies in the truckle bed while her father uses the marriage bed above. The nights blur together into a pattern of fumbling and forcing, and in his words, "I cannot help myself. A man must do it or he will go mad." Liga comes to know his rages and his sulks and his silences well enough to read them like weather. And Liga gets pregnant, however. It ends with even more misery for her as the first pregnancy ends in the snow outside the cottage as Liga feels cramping and staggers outside, and delivers what she does not yet know is a baby, but she understands it only as something that fell out of her. The text describes her kneeling over the small mass in the cold as the afterbirth follows. Her father returns, snatches the body away before she can properly look at it, and tells her it was nothing. She then goes back inside to make dinner and never speaks of it again. Later, she becomes pregnant a second time, but this time she's more cautious. She tries to hide it from her father by slaughtering rabbits and using their blood to fake her monthly bleeding. But her father grows suspicious and eventually discovers the truth when he forces her to show him one of the rags, finding it dry as an effing bone, as he says. So he continues to beat her and even kicks her in the stomach in an attempt to force him escape. When that fails, he turns to another method by paying Muddy Annie, the local mudwife, twice. First for a drink meant to induce an abortion under coercion, then again for herbs intended to bring it on. And both times, Liga does not fully understand what is being given to her or why, only that her body is being arranged according to someone else's purposes. Then her father dies after being thrown from a horse and found face down in a ditch with his head crushed in. When Liga finds him, she feels nothing. As the village women come to wash his body and lay him out, one of them lifts the cloth covering him. Looking at the part of him that had caused her so much pain, Liga sees it now as only scraps of flesh, such as you might trim from a plucked bird, nothing fearsome at all. And she buries him, keeps the house, and survives the winter alone. Soon after, she gives birth to a daughter she named Branza. The text leaves the child paternity unstated, though it strongly suggests her father was likely the parent. But her father's death, it would turn out, did not end her misery. Shortly after, Liga is gang raped by a group of village boys. Although the assault that follows is not described in detail by Hopkins Lanigan, the story that follows just tell you what happened. After the deed had been done, Liga takes the baby out of the chest and carries her to the stream while she washes herself. While her cringing parts, her torn, wrings out her dress and puts it back on. She walks into the forest until she reaches a precipice and considers throwing the baby first, then jumping. But when she holds the child out over the drop, she finds out that she cannot let go, so she considers instead to break the baby's head against a rock, saying, "I brained many a coney and kid, I would know exactly how," and finds she cannot do that either. And at this point, it is worth remembering, the book was marketed as a young adult novel for young readers. Imagine if Nickelodeon or Disney cast actual children in a film adaptation of the same material, then promoted it as family entertainment. Most people would immediately question the rating, the marketing, and whether it was truly appropriate for that audience. At the moment of the second birth, a supernatural intervention removes Liga and her daughters from the world and places them in a private heaven, which is a soft, static, endlessly safe version of the village, where no harm can reach them, where the men who exist there are gentle and pose no threat, and where Liga can raise her daughters in the peace she was never permitted to experience herself. The second act of the novel concerns what that removal cost all three of them. Liga's heaven is a world without growth, without real stakes, or any friction that makes the experience meaningful. Her daughters grow up beautiful and unharmed, but they are also growing up outside of reality. When the borders of Liga's refuge begin to break down, when magic men and wild bears cross into the protected space, and when Urda eventually finds a way back to the real world, the novel begins its extended examination of what it means to survive trauma by building a wall around yourself so high that nothing can reach you, including the things worth reaching for. The novel's content warnings is articulated openly in many readers' reviews and librarian assessments, as it includes incestuous rape, gang rape, miscarriage, and bestiality. the last arising in sequences involving men who have been transformed into bears and who engage in sexual behavior in that form. The bestiality content was among the elements that prompted the sharpest responses from readers who felt the young adult classification was indefensible. Flanagan addressed some of the controversy in a QA included in certain editions, where she noted that she chose to have Liga's rapists eventually raped in turn by shadow creatures created by Erda's magic, partly because she believed readers would find it satisfying as a conclusion to that thread of the narrative. That statement generated its own secondary debate among readers that felt that retributive rape was not a form of justice the novel should be endorsing as a satisfying resolution to sexual violence. The question of whether Tender Morsels belongs in the young adult category or the adult fiction section is one that the novel's publisher answered one way and a significant portion of its readership answered differently. It has been challenged and quietly removed from school shelves in multiple districts. It has also been defended by teachers and librarians who argued that its treatment of trauma is among the most honest and formally sophisticated available in any fiction marketed to younger readers. Both positions have been stated clearly, neither has displaced the other. While Tender Morsels was challenged for showing rape and violence in such graphic details, the next book on our list is Crank, another children's book which is based directly on the real-life meth addiction of the author's own daughter, and it has been banned, challenged, and removed from school libraries more consistently than almost any other book on this list. Crank, Ellen Hopkins, 2004. Crank follows Christina Snow, a 16-year-old straight-A honor roll student who visits her estranged father in Albuquerque for 3 weeks this summer before her junior year. Her father is rarely home, so Christina meets a boy named Adam who introduces her to crystal methamphetamine, referred to throughout the novel as the monster in Crank. Her addiction begins almost immediately. In the back room of a bowling alley, behind a stack of crates, Adam lays out a mirror, a razor blade, and a cut straw. He arranges 2 lines of yellowish white powder and tells her, "It'll take you to heaven, make you want to fly all night." Ellen Hopkins wrote Crank in free verse, which is in short, fragmented lines arranged in the page so the shape of the text itself mirrors Christina's mental state, which is what critics called mirror poems. In the story, when Christina gets high, she creates an alter ego she calls Bree, which is the version of herself that can do the things Christina cannot. And as the story continues, Bree takes over more and more of her life. Meanwhile, back in Reno after her 3 weeks with her father, she meets 2 boys. Chase, a football player who genuinely cares about her, and Brendan, who's something else entirely. In one scene features very obvious rape. Christina, running low on drugs, decided to call Brendan for a quick fix, so he drives her up a mountain road one Friday night where they snort crank in a grove of evergreens, drink beer. But Brendan has other plans, so he starts pulling at her clothes despite Christina telling him to stop. It is at this point where Christina is fully aware of Brendan's plans when he tells her he has waited for weeks, so he tells her to put up and shut up, then goes on to tear her shirt off her back despite her threatening to scream. Brendan proceeds to cover her mouth with his hand, and the scene continues across several pages, with Ellen mentioning, "Off came my shorts, down went his zipper." When it is over, Christina lays there sobbing while he finishes. He drives her home and makes her pay for the drugs. The next morning, still high and shaken, Christina starts the letter to Adam telling him she was raped, but she abandons it and calls Chase instead, who holds her, cries at her, and tells her it was not her fault. Then she asks him to have sex with her, but he says no, not until she is healed. However, that did not stop Christina from using, as she soon discovers that she's pregnant and assumes Chase was the father as she starts sleeping with him soon. However, when they used Planned Parenthood, it turns out it was more likely to be Brendan, so she decides to have an abortion. But when she feels the baby move, decides to keep it and tells her mother and stepfather about the pregnancy without telling them who the father is, which means she also does not tell them she was raped, which means she carries that alone through the last third of the book while her body changes and her addiction continues. The novel ends with Christina giving birth to a boy she names Hunter, described as healthy. The final pages makes clear she's still using and still trying to stop. Hopkins gives no resolution and no recovery arc for Christina, which of course made a lot of parents question what has been taught to their kids. Hopkins has stated the novel is approximately 60% factual, drawn from her own daughter's experience. The baby at the end of the book is real. Hopkins and her husband adopted him. He was 7 years old when the author's note was written. Crank landed on the LAA's top 10 most challenged books list in both 2010 and 2022. It ranked 38th on the list of the 100 most challenged books across the entire decade between 2010 and 2019. In 2022, it was among 52 books pulled by Utah's Alpine School District under HB 374. In 2009, Hopkins was banned from speaking at an Oklahoma middle school. She responded by noting she had heard from thousands of readers, including middle schoolers, that her books had turned them away from drugs. Was I in Mama's stomach too? The book starts simply enough with the child asking their mother a question about pregnancy after a family friend comes to visit with a visibly round belly. The mother settles onto the couch with her child and begins to explain everything. Like there are no censorship when the child asks how the baby got in there in the first place, and Dad walks through the door at exactly that moment. What follows on page 24 through 27 in this picture book, the recommended age of 3 to 6, is a step-by-step illustrated guide to sexual intercourse. That begins on page 24 by explaining that men and women have different bodies. The facing illustration shows 2 fully nude adult figures, anatomically complete, labeled breasts, labia, on the woman, penis, scrotum on the man. The figures face the reader directly, and on page 25, two adults are illustrated kissing, caressing, and cuddling across three separate illustrated panels, all presented in the book's cheerful cartoon style, hearts floating around the figures. Page 27 is where the parent in the Ohio library filed her complaint. The text reads, in the book's own words, the man likes to caress the woman's breasts and vagina. The woman strokes the man's penis. The penis becomes very big and very stiff. The illustration beside this text shows two new adult figures in bed together. Below that, the text continues. Then the man pushes his penis into the woman's vagina, and he keeps moving it in and out. It's a nice feeling. The most beautiful part happens when the man's semen flows into the woman's vagina. The accompanying illustration in that same page shows the two figures during intercourse, rendered in the same cartoon style as every other image in the book. The caption, afterward the two are mostly tired, and they snuggle together and fall asleep. The book was originally published in German in 2014 by Lo Verlag under the title War ich auch in Mama's Bauch, translated into English in 2019 by Sky Pony Press. It reflects a European tradition of early childhood sex education that treats reproduction and anatomy as subjects requiring honest, matter-of-fact explanation rather than age-stated introduction. In Germany and much of Northern Europe, picture books that explain intercourse to young children are not considered unusual. However, in America, some parents showed their protestation by claiming that the libraries that had the book was hiding pornography in plain sight. While one mother has rent to relocate the book, there's been no public feedback about the end of that matter.